Great to be with all of you today. So I'm going to talk about populism and democracy in comparative perspective, focusing on the case of Hungary and making some comparisons with the US. The broad theme of this work is about the relationship between populism and popularity, and the challenges for populists in maintaining power, and the temptation, both embedded in populist ideology and more generally for parties in power, to attempt to erode checks and balances as a way of preserving power when popularity wanes. I'm going to focus on a case study of Fidesz in Hungary and the way it has attempted to use changes to election law to extend its dominant place in Hungarian politics, and the dynamic strategic interaction between Fidesz and opposition parties as they have failed to and increasingly learned to coordinate in the new electoral system to effectively compete with Fidesz. And there's some open questions there about what will happen. I'll make a comparison with the collapse of the Trump administration in the USA and discuss the road forward. Populism is a multifaceted concept, lots of dimensions to it, lots of different aspects. One of the constants in populism, I would argue, is a distrust of existing political institutions and elites. This is often joined with nationalism, though not always, and typically coupled with pursuit of power by leaders who argue that in the face of corrupt existing institutions and elites, they will more directly channel a popular will and represent the people. Populism often considers itself to be an exclusive ideology focused on the national interest and the special characteristics of the people, especially right-wing populism, in comparison with other cultures. And populists typically resist checks on power, especially authoritarian-tinged populists, and many populists are. Authoritarian populism directs people toward a distrust of elites, as noted, and elites often resist populism through checks and balances. Populists work to undermine those, be that weakening the freedom of the press, freedom of the judiciary, and beyond. There's long roots in these practices. Arguably, the first populist politician to hold power in democratically in the world was Andrew Jackson in the United States in the 1830s. Jackson declared war on the Bank of the United States. He reorganized the bureaucracy to focus on packing it with his supporters and what he called the spoils system, and he overrode constitutional protections and the Supreme Court to violate the rights of Native peoples in the southeastern United States. Now, that's the perspective in terms of what populists see themselves as representing the people, and this justifies a certain degree of pushing against these corrupt elites. The challenge for populists is that, like all parties, populist parties will eventually lose elections as their opposition adapts. A fundamental aspect of democratic theory, and social choice theory in particular, is that no majority is forever. No party can hold power forever in a democracy. They will lose as the opposition adapts. And this holds true both if there is a core, that is some kind of pivotal voter who decides who wins, and if there's no core. It's a general result, I will argue. Along the lines of Riker in his book Liberalism Against Populism from 1982, I'm going to argue that neither populists nor anyone else ever conclusively represents the people. It's at best a conditional and short-term mandate populists' claims to represent the people in some fundamental way, thus are problematic in the context of social choice theory. So let's look at just a couple of quick illustrations. The simplest kind of model of political competition is one where we think about a single ideological or issue dimension on which candidates compete. And here I'm taking what is in some ways the tough case for the argument I'm making, which is there is a median voter in such a context, and Downs' median voter model suggests the candidate or party closest to the median will win. But if we take the strategic implications seriously, the implication is that, in a sense, election outcomes are going to become a coin flip. The parties will, in one way or another, position themselves such that as random processes, be they which party ends up happening to be closer to the median voter, or simply a randomization by an indifferent voter, the party in power will lose. A more general kind of situation involves when there is no core, when the majority rule is inherently unstable in terms of there being no voter or no group of voters who will dictate the outcome, because many coalitions are possible. And so here, if we consider a distributive politics game where different districts or different constituencies of some kind are receiving benefits or policies that favor them, I walk through an example where we start out with one party in control with support from constituencies A and B, and then the second party realigns their program in a way that appeals to constituency B and C and wins. And then the next party can come back and come up with a new appeal to constituencies A and C and win, followed by a different appeal that better satisfies constituencies B and C, they win, and then the initial appeal can win again. This is an illustration of cyclic majorities, the Condorcet cycle, the idea that quite often in politics there is simply no stable majority. And obviously, if there's no stable majority, it's always the case that whatever party is in power can potentially be defeated, provided the opposition figures out what the platform is that can bring that about. So the upshot of this brief theoretical discussion is that in a democracy, the party in power will always eventually be defeated, provided the opposition is reasonably capable and strategic. And the temptation for populists, like other parties, but arguably populists even more, given their claims to a deep connection to the people, is and their their view that they have some role in saving the people from the corruption of elites, is to try to reform the system in ways that facilitate and aid the preservation of their own power. Such reforms, I will argue, can potentially delay defeat for populists, but if the resulting system isn't too anti-democratic, the losses will only be delayed. And this brings us to the discussion of Hungary. Hungary had a hard middle of the 20th century. The Kingdom of Hungary was divided up with populations that had Hungarian minorities shifting to various neighboring countries. After World War I and the Treaty of Trianon, Hungarian revisionism helped fuel siding with Germany in World War II on the hope that they might get some of these territories back. That mostly did not happen. And after the war, obviously not at all. Now, Hungarian nationalism helped fuel some movements that had strong liberal components, including the revolt in 1956 and the resistance to the Soviet Union and bringing down the Iron Curtain in 1989. But there's this latent potentiality and nationalist sentiment in Hungary that parties potentially could draw on. In the post-communist era, there were many parties that emerged. The electoral system was initially similar to that of Germany, with less than half the parliament elected using single-member districts, and those elections as multi-round runoff elections. So you could have many parties, and then the top two would ultimately contest this. And the rest of the parliament was elected using proportional representation with compensation for parties which didn't win very many single-member districts compared to their vote totals. Fidesz, the Alliance of Young Democrats, was initially a minor party. They first held power in a coalition government in 1998. They were then defeated in 2002, and then they won a two-thirds majority in parliament from 2010 through the next election is in May 2022. And the I've got some of these animated. You can see here the size of the different party blocks in the Hungarian parliament over time, and the strong performance of the Socialist Party at one point through the early part of the first decade of this century, and then Fidesz in partnership with their smaller partner KDNP, achieving a robust majority across the last several elections. Now, starting in 2010, Fidesz had a two-thirds majority in the parliament, which is significant because the Hungarian constitution is relatively easy to amend. It simply requires a two-thirds parliamentary majority. And so the two-thirds majority won in 2010 allowed Fidesz to replace the entire constitution with a new constitution that significantly revised voting rules, which is going to be my focus here, and to then more recently put in place amendments that further revised voting rules, making life in some ways more challenging for the opposition. Fidesz policies have evolved. In their first period in power, they were relatively libertarian and center-right. In their more recent time in power, they have tended toward more populist and authoritarian kinds of positions, favoring a stronger national role in the economy, anti-immigrant rhetoric and action. This picture here is of the border wall that Fidesz put up. This is of the cutting of the old border wall with Austria back when the Iron Curtain came down. And this was to keep out migrants. Aggressive pro-natalist policies and efforts to undermine their political competition. They sought to reduce judicial independence. The Constitutional Court was expanded, membership revised, retirement dates for justices shortened, and so forth. And various reports suggest challenges for judicial independence in Hungary as a result. There are various efforts to clamp down on civil society, including use of various strategies to reduce the presence of media supporting opposition. One of the strategies being to work with allies, subsidize allies to arguably to buy up competing news outlets and shift their focus or shut them down. When I was in Hungary, I talked with many unemployed former journalists who had worked for a variety of outlets from right-wing to left-wing, who were no longer working in the media space in Hungary because of these policies. They pushed out Central European University from Budapest, seeing it as a threat to the ruling party's positions and ideology. I want to focus on the electoral reforms. The new constitution dramatically reduced the size of parliament and increased the share of single-member districts, which was helpful for Fidesz because it was in the second decade of the 20th century the dominant, the only large party in Hungarian politics. And the electoral system was also transformed so that the single-member districts were now plurality rule districts. One round, the party that gets the most votes wins. And furthermore, any wasted votes for the winning party would shift into compensation for the winning party in the proportional round, thus reducing the degree to which the proportional share of the electoral system would in fact counterbalance disproportionality in the single member district outcomes. And they made a variety of other changes. All of these tended to help consolidate the advantages of Fidesz, the largest party, versus a fragmented opposition. And this fragmented opposition gave Fidesz very large advantages. For example, in 2014 parliamentary elections, Fidesz won 91% of the single-member districts, despite taking less than 45% of the nationwide vote. And so they won a minority of the vote, but it was a plurality of the vote in most districts. And they only won 20 of the districts with more than 50% of the vote. So a fragmented opposition that was unable to coordinate gave Fidesz their supermajorities in 2014. Recall the challenges of the opposition and its coordination efforts were partly driven by the electoral system changes. When you had a two-round election system, then you could have multiple parties entering a single-member district contest. One of those parties would then be the challenger to Fidesz in each of these districts where Fidesz initially won the plurality, and a substantial portion of the time, potentially, Fidesz would then lose to that single opposition party candidate. So that this created challenges for them. Similar pattern in mayoral elections in that year. Fidesz won many elections while receiving less than half the votes. And so the challenge for the opposition was how to coordinate. Well, they didn't do very well at that. You can see across a number of different elections for Hungarian parliament, there's been a substantial disproportionality where Fidesz has done much better in terms of the percentage of seats held relative to the percentage of votes received. And so 2014, very much that case. 2018, still very much that pattern. Many more seats held relative to the percentage of the vote received. And so the electoral system was magnifying the advantages of Fidesz as a large party, and conversely dampening the size of the opposition vote shares because the opposition was fragmented. Here's the composition of the current Hungarian parliament and the shares held by the different sides. So the challenge for the opposition then is one of coordination in these single-member districts. You're not going to win if you have a whole series of different votes going to different opposition parties, and Fidesz is able to win a plurality. But coordination is challenging for the opposition. If you coordinate ineffectively at a disadvantageous position, say one too far to the left, or you fail to coordinate between the left and right opposition parties, you will be in a position where Fidesz may well still be able to win. So simple coordination is difficult. 2014, there were efforts at coordination on the left, but they did very badly, and no success in coordinating between the left and right opposition to Fidesz. So this is the challenge faced by the opposition. In 2019, it began to appear that the opposition was figuring out how to deal with the revised electoral system. The vote share for Fidesz did not decrease significantly, but Fidesz performance cratered because the opposition held primary elections, chose one candidate to challenge the Fidesz candidate in each of the single-member district municipal elections held across the country, and consequently the opposition did much better. So if you look at the disproportionality between Fidesz seat share versus vote share in the municipal elections, there was no disproportionality by comparison with many other elections which had much more disproportionality. And so the key for the opposition in terms of figuring out how to counter Fidesz was in those elections learning to coordinate. And in a sense, they're learning the lesson of what's called Duverger's law, that in single-member district plurality elections, a two-party system is the primary way to go. You're not going to win if you cannot coordinate into a single large coalition in opposition. And so this coordination, contrary Fidesz, was facilitated in 2019 by common opposition to Fidesz arguments about corruption. The right party, Jobbik, was able to cooperate with the parties on the left, and they used primaries to deal with some of the challenges of bargaining between the different parties to pick those single candidates. The 2022 parliamentary elections obviously have not yet happened. The opposition is attempting to learn the lessons from 2019. They're using primaries to pick the candidates, and this choice of candidates in primaries is proceeding. It hasn't fully happened yet, but this looks like it potentially gives the opposition a better chance. Fidesz has sought to make things more challenging for the opposition by trying to force complete coordination. The electoral system would have allowed the parties to coordinate on a single candidate in each district, but also to each have their own nationwide list for the proportional part of the vote. What Fidesz has done in changing electoral rules over the last year has been to force the opposition away from that towards having to have a single nationwide list for the proportional share of the voting as well. This is challenging. The opposition includes both a party on the right and a party on the left. But we have in the polling post these rule changes, it looks like it is likely to be very close between a united opposition, provided they can stay united, and Fidesz, and it's not clear which side will win the upcoming parliamentary election. Now, I want to compare this a little bit to the U.S., and then I'll wrap up pretty quickly here. In the U.S., we had a surprise electoral victory for populist Donald Trump in 2016. Trump sought to override various democratic norms. He cast doubt on election results, both when he won and when he lost. There were many lawsuits. Trump's efforts were capped by the January 6th riot, where Trump supporters attempted to disrupt the counting of electoral votes and the official selection of the next president. And Trump sought to use executive powers to reshape policy in a variety of ways. But in the US, the system held. There was no prospect of amending the Constitution. Amendment is much more difficult in the US, and Trump lacked the majorities to do it. The courts pushed back against various efforts, such as changing the way the census counted residents in order to potentially aid Republican representation. There was no ability to control or reshape election procedures, which were managed completely out of Trump's control by state and local officials. And Trump was defeated in the 2020 presidential election and twice impeached by the US House of Representatives. So wrapping this up, in the Hungarian case, we see some advantages bought by Fidesz may be short-lived. The ability to constrain civic society may be limited in the absence of Chinese levels of control over the internet. And the advantages derived from being a large party in a redesigned electoral system can potentially even flip if the opposition unites, and certainly can be reduced as the opposition adapts to the new institutional environment strategically. And so the opposition seems to be learning those lessons. You can't win in a single member plurality district unless you have a single candidate for the opposition. And more broadly, I think these comparative cases highlight the importance of maintaining democratic institutions. The popularity of populists will wax and wane. Populists are not always popular. So long as democracy is preserved in terms of democratic electoral institutions, populists will find that eventually they become unpopular and other voices will take power, at least for a time. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much.